The Bronx, BRNKS, is the northernmost of the 5 boroughs of New York City in the U.S. state of New York, located south of Westchester County. Many bridges and tunnels link the Bronx to the island and borough of Manhattan to the west over and under the narrow Harlem River, as well as 3 longer bridges south over the East River to the borough of Queens. Of the 5 boroughs, the Bronx is the only one on the U.S. mainland and with a land area of 42 square miles and a population of 1,438,159 in 2014, has the 4th largest land area, the 4th highest population, and the 3rd highest population density. The Bronx is divided by the Bronx River into a hillier section in the west, closer to Manhattan, and a flatter eastern section, closer to Long Island. East and West Street addresses are divided by Jerome Avenue, the continuation of Manhattan's Fifth Avenue. The West Bronx was annexed to New York City in 1874, and the areas east of the Bronx River in 1895. Bronx County was separated from New York County in 1914. Although the Bronx is the 3rd most densely populated county in the United States, about a quarter of its area is open space, including Woodlawn Cemetery, Van Cortlandt Park, Pelham Bay Park, the New York Botanical Garden and the Bronx Zoo in the borough's north and center, on land deliberately reserved in the late 19th century as urban development progressed northwards and eastwards from Manhattan with the building of roads, bridges and railways. The Bronx is named after Jonas Bronck, who created the first settlement as part of the New Netherland colony in 1639. The native Lenape were displaced after 1643 by settlers. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the Bronx received many immigrant groups as it was transformed into an urban community, first from various European countries and later from the Caribbean region, as well as African American migrants from the American South. This cultural mix has made the Bronx a wellspring of both Latin music and hip-hop. The Bronx contains one of the 5 poorest congressional districts in the United States, the 15th, but its wide diversity also includes affluent, upper-income and middle-income neighborhoods such as Riverdale, Fieldston, Spoyton, Deweyville, Schuylerville, Pelham Bay, Pelham Gardens, Morris Park and Country Club. The Bronx, particularly the South Bronx, saw a sharp decline in population, livable housing, and the quality of life in the late 1960s and the 1970s, culminating in a wave of arson. Since then the communities have shown significant redevelopment starting in the late 1980s before picking up pace in the 1990s into today. History. European colonization of the Bronx began in 1639. The Bronx was originally part of Westchester County, but it was ceded to New York County in fragments before it became Bronx County. Etymology. The Bronx was called Rananchka by the native Sawanoi band of Lenape, while other Native Americans knew the Bronx as Keskaskek. It was divided by the Aquahung River. Jonas Bronck was a Swedish-born emigrant from Komstad, Norrljunga parish in Småland, Sweden, who arrived in New Netherland during the spring of 1639. He became the first recorded European settler in the area now known as the Bronx. He leased land from the Dutch West India Company on the neck of the mainland immediately north of the Dutch settlement in Harlem, and bought additional tracts from the local tribes. He eventually accumulated 500 acres between the Harlem River and the Aquahung, which became known as Bronx River, or the Bronx. Dutch and English settlers referred to the area as Bronx land. The American poet William Bronck was a descendant of Peter Bronck, either Jonas Bronck's son or his younger brother. The Bronx is referred to, both legally and colloquially, with a definite article, as the Bronx. The name for this region, apparently after the Bronx River, first appeared in the annexed district of the Bronx created in 1874 out of part of Westchester County and was continued in the borough of the Bronx. which included a larger annexation from Westchester County in 1898. The use of the definite article is attributed to the style of referring to rivers. Another explanation for the use of the definite article in the borough's name is that the original form of the name was a possessive or collective, one referring to the family, as in visiting the Bronx or the Bronx. Before 1914, the development of the Bronx is directly connected to its strategic location between New England and New York. Control over the bridges across the Harlem River plagued the period of British colonial rule. Kingsbridge, built in 1693 where Broadway reached the Spoit and Deweyville Creek, was a possession of Frederick Phillips, Lord of Phillips Manor. The tolls were resented by local farmers on both sides of the creek. In 1759, the farmers led by Jacobus Dykeman and Benjamin Palmer built a free bridge across the Harlem River which led to the abandonment of tolls altogether. The territory now contained within Bronx County was originally part of Westchester County, one of the 12 original counties of the English province of New York. The present Bronx County was contained in the town of Westchester and parts of the towns of Yonkers, Eastchester, and Pelham. In 1846, a new town, West Farms, was created by division of Westchester. In turn, in 1855, the town of Morrisania was created from West Farms. In 1873, the town of Kingsbridge was established within the former borders of Yonkers. Among famous settlers in the Bronx in the 19th and early 20th centuries were the author Willa Cather, the tobacco merchant Pierre Lorillard, and the inventor Jordan L. Mott, who established Mott Haven to house the workers at his iron works. The consolidation of the Bronx into New York City proceeded in two stages. In 1873, the state legislature annexed Kingsbridge, West Farms and Morrisania to New York. Effective in 1874, the three towns were abolished in the process. In 1895, 3 years before New York's consolidation with Brooklyn, Queens and Staten Island, the whole of the territory east of the Bronx River, including the town of Westchester and portions of Eastchester and Pelham, were annexed to the city. City Island, a nautical community, voted to join the city in 1896. On January 1, 1898, the consolidated city of New York was born, including the Bronx as one of the 5 distinct boroughs. On April 19, 1912, those parts of New York County which had been annexed from Westchester County in the past decades were newly constituted as Bronx County, the 62nd and last county to be created by the state, effective in 1914. Bronx County's courts opened for business on January 2, 1914. The South Bronx was for many years a manufacturing center, and in the early part of the 20th century was noted as a center of piano manufacturing. In 1919, the Bronx was the site of 63 piano factories employing more than 5,000 workers. 20th century. After 1914, the history of the Bronx during the 20th century may be divided into 4 periods. A boom period during 1900 to 29, with a population growth by a factor of 6 from 200,000 in 1900 to 1.3 million in 1930. The Great Depression and post-World War II years saw a slowing of growth leading into an eventual decline. The mid to late century were hard times, as the Bronx declined 1950 to 85 from a predominantly moderate income to a predominantly lower income area with high rates of violent crime and poverty. The Bronx has experienced an economic and developmental resurgence starting in the late 1980s that continues into today. New York City expands for generations a mostly rural area of small farms supplying the city markets. The Bronx grew into a railroad suburb in the late 19th century. Faster transportation allowed for rapid population growth in the late 19th century. involving the move from horse-drawn streetcars to elevated railways and the subway system, which linked to Manhattan in 1904. The South Bronx was for many years a manufacturing center, and in the early part of the 20th century was noted as a center of piano manufacturing. In 1919, the Bronx was the site of 63 piano factories employing more than 5,000 workers. At the end of World War I, the Bronx hosted the rather small 1918 World's Fair at 177th Street and DeVoe Avenue. The Bronx underwent rapid urban growth after World War I. Extensions of the New York City subway contributed to the increase in population as thousands of immigrants came to the Bronx, resulting in a major boom in residential construction. Among these groups, many Irish Americans, Italian Americans and especially Jewish Americans settled here. In addition, French, German, Polish and other immigrants moved into the borough. The Jewish population also increased notably during this time. In 1937, according to Jewish organizations, 592,185 Jews lived in the Bronx, while only 54,000 Jews lived in the borough in 2011. Many synagogues still stand in the Bronx, but most have been converted to other uses. Decline in Prohibition days, bootleggers and gangs were active in the Bronx. Irish, Italian, Jewish and Polish gangs smuggled in most of the illegal whiskey. The oldest sections of the borough began to become poverty-stricken areas. Between 1930 and 1960, moderate and upper-income Bronxites rapidly began to relocate from the southwestern neighborhoods of the borough. This migration has left a mostly poor African American and Hispanic population in the West Bronx. Most predominantly non-Hispanic white communities today are located in the eastern and northwestern sections of the borough. From the mid-1960s to the late 1970s, the quality of life for many Bronx residents declined sharply. Historians and social scientists have put forward many factors. They include the theory that Robert Moss's Cross-Bronx Expressway destroyed existing residential neighborhoods. Another factor in the Bronx's decline may have been the development of high-rise housing projects, especially in the South Bronx. Yet another may have been a reduction in the real estate listings and property-related financial services offered in some areas of the Bronx, a process known as redlining. Others have suggested a planned shrinkage of municipal services, such as firefighting. There was also much debate as to whether rent control laws had made it less profitable for landlords to maintain existing buildings with their existing tenants than to abandon or destroy those buildings. In the 1970s, the Bronx was plagued by a wave of arson. The burning of buildings was predominantly in the poorest communities, like the South Bronx. The most common explanation of what occurred was that landlords decided to burn their low property value buildings and take the insurance money, as it was more lucrative to get insurance money than to refurbish or sell a building in a severely distressed area. The Bronx became identified with a high rate of poverty and unemployment, which was mainly a persistent problem in the South Bronx. Out of 289 census tracts in the Bronx borough, 7 tracts lost more than 97% of their buildings to fire and abandonment between 1970 and 1980. Another 44 tracts had more than 50% of their buildings meet the same fate. By the early 1980s, the South Bronx was considered one of the most blighted urban areas in the country, with a loss of 60% of the population and 40% of housing units. However, starting in the 1990s, many burned-out and run-down tenements were replaced by multi-unit housing. Revitalization. Since the late 1980s, significant development has occurred in the Bronx, first stimulated by the city's 10-year housing plan, and community members working to rebuild the social, economic and environmental infrastructure by creating affordable housing. Groups affiliated with churches in the South Bronx erected the Nehemiah Homes with about 1,000 units. The grassroots organization Nos Quedamos endeavor known as Melrose Commons began to rebuild areas in the South Bronx. The IRT White Plains Road line began to show an increase in riders. Chains such as Marshalls, Staples, and Target opened stores in the Bronx. More bank branches opened in the Bronx as a whole, although not primarily in poor or minority neighborhoods. While the Bronx still has fewer branches per person than other boroughs. In 1997, the Bronx was designated an All-America City by the National Civic League, acknowledging its comeback from the decline of the mid-century. In 2006, the New York Times reported that construction cranes have become the borough's new visual metaphor, replacing the window decals of the 1980s in which pictures of potted plants and drawn curtains were placed in the windows of abandoned buildings. The borough has experienced substantial new building construction since 2002. Between 2002 and June 2007, 33,687 new units of housing were built or were underway and $4.8 billion has been invested in new housing. In the first 6 months of 2007 alone, total investment in new residential development was $965 million and 5,187 residential units were scheduled to be completed. Much of the new development is springing up in formerly vacant lots across the South Bronx.